Let's get into it.
Let's figure out how this magnetic magic actually happens.
Okay, so it's this interesting mix, really. Old physics principles, but very modern neuroscience application. At its core, TMS, it's a procedure using magnetic fields.
Okay.
And these fields influence nerve cells in the brain,
Right.
crucially without any surgery or anything invasive.
Okay, non-invasive, that seems key. And your source material really stresses its growing use, right? For neurological stuff, psychiatric conditions,
Yeah.
especially depression.
Yes, depression is definitely a major focus. It's often presented as a real alternative, particularly for patients who, haven't responded well to other treatments.
Like medication or therapy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or maybe those aren't suitable options for them. For some people, TMS can be a really important pathway forward.
Okay, so let's get into the how. Walk us through the mechanism. How can a magnetic field outside the head actually affect brain cells inside? What's the physics?
Right. Well, it actually goes back quite a way. 19th century, Michael Faraday.
Faraday. Wait, the electromagnetic induction guy.
That's the one. Electromagnetic induction, that's the absolute foundation here.
Okay, so changing magnetic fields create electrical currents. How does that apply?
So the TMS device has this specialized coil. An electrical current runs through it, and this generates brief but pretty powerful magnetic pulses.
Okay, powerful magnetic pulses coming from this coil,
And that coil is placed right against a specific spot on the patient's scalp.
right on the head.
Yep. And here's the kind of amazing part, that magnetic field. It just passes straight through the skull, harmlessly.
Wow, okay. No need to cut anything, it just goes through the bone.
It does. But then, once that magnetic field gets inside the brain tissue, because it's changing rapidly, remember?
Faraday's principle kicks in?
Faraday's principle kicks in.
Right.
Exactly. It induces or creates a small electrical current right there in the brain tissue itself.
So the magnet outside makes electricity inside.
That's the connection. And this induced current, even though it's small, it's focused, and it's just strong enough to influence the neurons there,
The brain cells.
the brain's main signaling cells, yeah.
How does it influence them? Just gives them a little jolt.
It causes them to depolarize. Basically, it changes the electrical charge across the neuron's membrane for a moment.
Okay, depolarization. And if that reaches a certain point,
If it reaches the threshold, yep, they fire. They send off an electrical signal. That's called an action potential.
which is how neurons talk to each other.
That's the fundamental communication. So by carefully controlling these magnetic pulses where they go, how strong they are, TMS can essentially make specific groups of neurons fire, or it can influence their pattern of firing.
Right, so by making them fire, or maybe even stopping them from firing too much in a very specific spot,
Yeah.
you're sort of fine-tuning that brain circuit.
That's the goal, yes. If a circuit is, say, underactive in depression or maybe overactive in anxiety, you're trying to modulate that activity, nudge it back towards a more normal pattern.
Rebalancing.
Rebalance, exactly.
Now, your sources mentioned it's not just about one pulse, right? The pattern of pulses is really important. This is where repetitive TMS comes in, RTMS.
Absolutely. A single pulse has a fleeting effect.
Yeah.
For therapy, you need repetition. And the way you repeat the pulse is the frequency, the pattern that determines the effect.
Okay, so tell me about these different patterns. What if you pulse fast? Like, say, 5 times a second, maybe more.
Okay, so that's generally called high-frequency RTMS, usually 5 hertz, so 5 pulses per second or higher. And this typically has an excitatory effect.
Excites the neurons, makes them more active.
Exactly. It tends to increase the activity in the brain region right under the coil. So it's used when you think an area is underactive.
Like in depression, your source mentioned a specific area.
Yes, the classic example is stimulating the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in depression. That area often shows reduced activity in people with depression, so the idea is to boost it.
Okay, high frequency ramps things up. Makes sense. What about the opposite? Slow pulses, maybe just once a second or even less.
Right, that's low-frequency RTMS, usually 1 hertz or lower. And this generally has the opposite effect. It's inhibitory.
So it quiets things down?
It tends to decrease the activity in the targeted region. So you'd use this for conditions where you think a particular brain area might be overactive.
Okay, examples.
Your sources mention things like some anxiety disorders or potentially trying to reduce the activity in areas linked to auditory hallucinations and schizophrenia.
Gotcha. So you've got this toolkit, boost or inhibit, high or low frequency. But these effects from one session, they don't last forever, right? How does doing this over, say, several weeks actually lead to lasting change?
That's a million-dollar question. And the answer seems to lie in one of the coolest concepts in neuroscience: neuroplasticity.
The brain changing itself. I love this topic.
Me too. It's fundamental. The brain isn't static, right? It's constantly adapting, rewiring, changing its connections based on
It's
experience.
forming new pathways, strengthening old ones.
Exactly. And the idea is that repetitive TMS stimulation actually taps into and guides this natural plasticity.
How? How does zapping it basically encourage it to rewire?
Well, the thinking is that repeatedly making those neurons fire together or inhibiting them together strengthens or weakens the connections, the synapses between them.
The junctions where they communicate.
Precisely. And over the course of treatment, these repeated changes in synaptic strength seem to lead to more stable, long-lasting alterations in how that whole brain circuit functions.
Okay, are there like biological terms for these changes?
Yes, there are. High-frequency stimulation, the excitatory kind, is thought to promote something called long-term potentiation, or LTP.
LTP sounds important.
It is. Think of it as making the connection between two neurons stronger and more efficient when they fire together repeatedly. Neurons that fire together wire together, essentially.
Oh, okay, so you're strengthening a pathway, making it easier to use.
You got it. And conversely, the low-frequency stimulation, the inhibitory kind, can induce long-term depression, or LTD.
Depression, like the mood disorder.
No, different meaning here. LTD in this context means a weakening of the synaptic connection. It makes communication across that synapse less likely or less efficient.
Got it. LTP strengthens, LTD weakens,
Yeah.
and both are part of how the brain learns and adapts normally.
Exactly. They're fundamental mechanisms of plasticity. So TMS seems to be leveraging these natural processes.
So it's not just a temporary zap, it's more like training wheels for the brain circuit, guiding it to rewire itself in a more helpful way.
That's a really good analogy, actually. You're using the stimulation to guide the brain's own capacity for change towards a therapeutic goal.
Okay, this sounds incredibly targeted, but how on earth do they know exactly where to put the coil on someone's head and how strong the pulse should be? People's heads and brains aren't identical, right?
No, they're not. And that's a really crucial point. There's a calibration step, a personalization step that happens before treatment starts. It's called motor threshold mapping.
Motor threshold mapping. Okay, break that down.
So first, they position the TMS coil over the part of the brain that controls movement, the motor cortex.
Okay, the bit that makes your hand move, for example.
Exactly. Then they deliver single TMS pulses and start increasing the intensity, the power of the pulse, bit by bit.
And they're watching the patient.
They're watching, usually the patient's hand or thumb.
Yeah.
They keep increasing the intensity until they see a small, consistent twitch or movement in the hand.
So the twitch tells them, okay, this intensity is enough to make neurons fire in this specific person's brain.
Precisely. The minimum intensity needed to get that visible muscle twitch about half the time. That's the individual's motor threshold.
A personal dose.
Exactly. It serves as a reference point. They then use a percentage of that threshold, say 110% or 120%, as the intensity for the actual treatment pulses delivered to the target area, like the prefrontal cortex.
And how do they find that prefrontal target spot?
Usually it's located based on standard measurements from the motor hotspot they just found. Sometimes they might use brain imaging, like an MRI, to guide the placement even more precisely.
That's pretty cool, using a muscle twitch to calibrate a brain treatment. Now, your source material also mentioned a couple of newer variations on TMS.
Yes, the technology is still evolving. People are exploring ways to reach different areas or just make treatment more efficient. One variation is deep TMS, or TTMS.
Deep TMS. Sounds like it goes deeper.
That's the idea. It uses a different kind of coil, often called an H-coil because of its shape. This design allows the magnetic field to penetrate further into the brain tissue
Okay, reaching deeper structures.
and stimulating a larger volume of brain tissue compared to the standard figure-8 coils used in regular RTMS.
So that would be useful if the brain circuits involved in a condition are, well, deeper down, not right on the surface.
Exactly. Your sources mention its use for things like obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, where some of the involved brain networks are thought to be located deeper within the brain.
Makes sense. And there was another one. It sounded really fast.
Yes. Theta burst stimulation, or TBS.
Theta burst.
This is a newer form of RTMS. It delivers the pulses in these very short, rapid bursts in a pattern that actually mimics the brain's natural theta brainwave rhythm.
Okay, mimicking natural brain activity. What's the big advantage there?
Speed, efficiency. A full session at TBS can be incredibly short.
How short?
Sometimes just a few minutes, like 3 minutes, compared to maybe 20, 30, even 40 minutes for a standard RTMS session.
Wow, 3 minutes versus half an hour or more.
Yeah. And studies suggest it could be just as effective, particularly for depression.
That's a game changer. Cutting down treatment time that much has got to make it way more accessible for people.
Absolutely. It addresses a major practical barrier fitting those daily sessions into life.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together. What we've unpacked from your source material today is that this TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation,
Mm,
it's a genuinely innovative, non-invasive approach
right. It used that basic physics principle, electromagnetic conduction, from Faraday.
to send magnetic pulses safely through the skull. No cutting involved,
And those pulses then create these little targeted electrical currents inside the brain.
which can then excite or inhibit nerve cells depending on the pulse pattern, the frequency.
Exactly. High frequency tends to excite, low frequency tends to inhibit. And doing this repetitively, day after day.
That's where the magic happens, right? It taps into the brain's own ability to change itself. Neuroplasticity.
Right. It guides plasticity through things like LTP strengthening connections and LTD weakening them, leading to potentially lasting changes in brain function,
And it's personalized using that motor threshold mapping to get the dose right.
which makes it a really targeted therapy, offering new hope for people with a growing number of these challenging neurological and psychiatric disorders.
Yeah. Understanding this whole process, from Faraday's idea through to neuroplasticity, it really gives you a much deeper insight into where modern brain therapies are heading.
It really underscores how dynamic the brain is. It's not just a fixed computer.
Definitely not. And it's fascinating that TMS seems to work because the brain is dynamic. It relies on that capacity for change, neuroplasticity.
That's the key mechanism, it seems.
So here's something to think about, maybe for you listening. If the effectiveness of TMS really hinges on stimulating and guiding the brain's own ability to reorganize, what other kinds of therapies might become possible? What other frontiers could we unlock by finding new ways to precisely guide the brain's inherent capacity for change?
Hmm. That's a big, exciting question for the future.